Good morning, TITUS Camp, and welcome to Manna in the morning. My name is Kaleb Baker, and we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 9 just for a few moments this morning. And I know this is a chapter that we're all familiar with. We know that it's the chapter that contains Saul's conversion, and yes, Saul is going to be the subject of our time together this morning. But before we can get to Acts chapter 9, I think we first need to look just a few chapters back in chapter 7. The first time that we see Saul's name mentioned is actually there at the end. And the reason we see Saul's name mentioned is because he's at the stoning of a man by the name of Stephen. And what Verse 58 indicates to us is that when they dragged Stephen out of the city, Stephen's accusers took off their coats and they threw them at the feet of a man by the name of Saul. And just a few verses down in chapter 8 and verse 1, it tells us that Saul was one of the witnesses and he agreed completely with what was happening to Stephen. Now, this compels us to believe that, maybe Saul didn't have anything to do with the actual killing of Stephen, but I think this may have been an example that was set for him. An example of what he needs to go out and do, maybe, once he leaves here. Because, I think it's believed that Saul was being brought up under Gamaliel, and so he was probably being groomed to take a position of authority such as a priest. But before we talk a little more about Saul, let's talk about Stephen for just a minute, because Stephen, man, I just love Stephen's story. We don't know much about Stephen, but we know more about Stephen than some other characters in Scripture. Scripture does enlighten us to some things about Stephen, and basically Stephen was a deacon that was selected by the apostles there in Jerusalem, and it is said that Stephen was a man full of God's grace and power. He performed amazing miracles and signs among the people. But verse 10 is one that I really want us to pay close attention to. Verse 10 says, "None of them could stand against the wisdom and the spirit with which Stephen spoke." And so if you fast forward to chapter 7, verse 58, you see Saul, and he's there. He's at the stoning of Stephen. And the reason that Stephen is being stoned is because Stephen was brought before the council because there were some accusers that accused him of blaspheming God. And so Stephen saw it as an opportunity to preach the gospel. And Saul was there to hear it. And so with all of that being said, I think now we can look at Acts chapter 9. At the beginning of Acts chapter 9, to kind of set the scene between the end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 9, a lot of what's been going on is Saul and his people have been going out and just trying to stop the spreading of the gospel in whatever way they can. At the beginning of chapter 9, they're getting ready to do just that in a place called Damascus. And so Saul goes to the high priests and he has them to write letters to send to Damascus, basically just to warn them, hey, buckle up, we're on our way. We're fixing to do to y'all what we've been doing to everybody else. And that's where we're going to pick up this morning, is in Acts chapter 9 and verse 3. It says, "As he was approaching Damascus on this mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. And the voice replied, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Now, the thing that just amazes me so much about this whole situation, two things really. One, Saul's immediate surrender. That stands out to me. But the second thing that really stands out to me is the way that Jesus asked that question to Saul. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The way that Jesus asked that question is almost as if he expects Saul to know who he is. And I think Saul's accounts of what happened later on in Acts may indicate that to us, that Jesus knew what he was doing. Of course, he always did, right? And he always does. So with that in mind, let's go back to the end of chapter 7 and verse 58. Saul was present to hear the sermon that Stephen preached. And if you remember what was said about Stephen back in chapter 6, it says none of them could stand against the wisdom and the spirit with which Stephen spoke. Not even Saul. Saul heard the gospel preached that day. And I think it had already been working on him a little bit by the time Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus. And we look at Saul's story, and we wonder, how in the world could somebody transform like that? How could somebody change their lives so radically? I think the answer's found in Saul's surrender. And so if we want to experience that same kind of transformation in our lives, then I think it starts in the same place. On our knees before our Father. And He'll take care of the rest.